Amazing. Thank you so much, Ken. So, it's interesting. One of our conversations about this began by my asking Ken to speak about the challenges that Gunther put before us. And Ken immediately responded by saying, opportunities, not challenges. And that was really amazing. I just thought that was really interesting because I saw them as challenges. I think maybe it's the difference between us in a sense about confidence, because I very much admired Ken even back then, because I felt like Ken, I just have to say was the most prepared musician I think I ever met. Like in other words, when it came to those sessions, you played everything flawlessly, and I was a nervous wreck. So you might have been a nervous wreck too. I have no idea. But
I was.
okay, thank you. Good to know. But for me, but I'm just going to start by speaking a little bit about those challenges or opportunities. My first encounter with Gunther was actually meeting him when he went to recruit musicians in the inner city. I was in All City Jazz Band in Philadelphia, and he and Webster Lewis came in, and they were looking for a different kind of musician to go to conservatories, meaning that they were going to inner city New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., LA, to find people and offer them full scholarships on the spot. And what it meant was you better play well at that rehearsal. And so, in Philly's All City Jazz Band was, Darryl Brown was in that band the year before, and Stanley Clark, and it had been a good source of musicians, And but when I got here, the first thing I did was I brought him a copy. I had found among my grandfather's papers a copy of Shuffle Along, U.B. Blake's musical from 1921, the Robert Russell Bennett arrangement of the selections. And I came into Gunther, I said, I knew he had a ragtime ensemble. I said, hey, you might be interested in this. And I showed him this, and he goes, wow, I've been looking for this for years. Nobody has this. And I said, well, it's missing like 6 or 7 parts. But he said, okay, look, we have a concert Friday. You fill in the 6 or 7 parts that's missing, and you bring it back to me on Thursday. Thank you, Gunther. So, that was the kind of challenge that right away, in other words, you're going to learn from doing it. But, I'm just going to throw in one more of these, and then I want to read what I wrote, because the next one that was so interesting was Gunther decided in my second year here, I think it was, which would have been 1974 or 5, to start a contemporary music ensemble at NEC. NEC did not have a contemporary music ensemble until then. And he already knew who he wanted for a lot of the slots in that. He wanted, Stephanie Judd, Bruce Creditor. There were certain people who you just knew were going to be there for, certain things at that time. And I'm sure Derek knows that. But he didn't know who he wanted on oboe. He just had no idea. And it was interesting because Lynn Jackin was in ragtime, and I would think he would have just picked her for this too. But he didn't know. And he came to a third string concert. And in those days, we'd go till 12:15 on those. He would stay the entire time. And I just remember after the concert, he comes, and in this concert, Rand had asked me to improvise a solo version of Mysterioso by Thelonious Monk, and because the concert's subject was Thelonious Monk's music, just improvise it. So I didn't even think about it. I thought I'll just base it on whatever happens before, which happened to be no, it was Crisscross was the song. That's right. And the group before me was playing Mysterioso. They were playing sort of as a Latin. They were playing salsa, honestly. It was a Cuban woman, Maritza Leal, was leading that band. And so I just listened, and then I got on stage with my oboe, and I improvised something, and I didn't even think about it. And then after the concert, Gunther comes to me and says, I want you to be in my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and I have some music for you. And okay, so you didn't ask him, like, what are you talking about? Or What is it? So I went up to his office and he has this pile of scores of oboe. No, I was not an oboe major. I was a composition major who played some oboe on the side. I mean, honestly, but he had these scores and they had microtones, they had 64th notes, they had like, I mean, they were just wild what this music was. And I took a look at them. I said, there must be some mistake. I mean, I can't play any of this. And he looks at me and he said, there's nothing in any of this music that's harder than what you did last night. And that was it. So I went home and practiced for weeks and learned these crazy pieces. But it was so funny. It was like I had, you know, he heard me go up to a high G or G sharp, and he heard me then swoop down to the B flat and play, you know, crazy runs all over the instruments. Like, okay. So, and I later on figured out that that was a little bit like the challenge he gave Eric Dolphy when he had these recordings where, you know, he ended up hiring 2 flute players. One of them was Robert D. Dominica, who was the dean of the school at the time, and Dolphy. And it's because Dolphy refused to read the written parts. And he really wanted at NEC to say to the, at NEC, he could say to a student, I was not Eric Dolphy, see, that's the point. He can say to a student, you do this. This is how you're going to learn. So to me, that was a very interesting part of his legacy. There were many other things about this. I mean, for one thing, Gunther, you know, I transferred here actually from Carnegie Mellon because my mother said I had to go to a real college for at least a year. And then she would let me go to music school. But I knew I wanted to go here from the beginning. But, you know, Carnegie Mellon was a great music school, but NEC was already a music scene. Like the way, you know, you think about like Vienna was a music scene, you know, or Paris in the 20s. And NEC was a music scene. Gunther Schuller was here, Jackie Bard was here, Rand Blake was here. That's how Gunther made it a music scene, by inviting people who were not the norm in education. And that was a very, very big deal. And it's, you know, I'm just going to read some of what I think of as Gunther's legacy here, and then I want to turn it over to Michael Frischkopf, who's waiting in Edmonton, Alberta, to talk about other, you know, what this legacy is in general, or whether music schools have really followed this legacy. So I think it's the philosophical legacies of iconoclastic thinkers in music. So teachers like Frank Battisti, Charles Peltz, Robert Kogan in music theory, Lyle Davidson in music education, John Heiss in music history, Peter Rowe in ethnomusicology and world music, Rand Blake in contemporary musical arts, Paula Robeson as a flute teacher. I mean, these were people who Gunther brought here, and they were different. They were not the faculty that you would find at other schools. Joe Maneri, who was not just a high school dropout, a grade school dropout. I mean, somebody who had not finished grade school, but was, as far as Gunther was concerned, the greatest musician on the New York scene at the time, and penniless and homeless, actually, when he was hired. And to bring him up as a full-time member of the theory faculty, Joe, I'll just say this, you know, so Joe was, you know, he was a student of Adolf Schmidt, so he knew a lot about theory. Adolf Schmidt was the main student of Alban Berg. But he'd studied all the 12-tone stuff, microtonal music, and all kinds of things like this. And but he had an interview, and you know, to come up, Jim Hoffman was the one who was the head of the undergraduate theory department at the time, and he and the last question that he asked, he said, well, the one thing is, our theory teachers really have to know about Schenkerian analysis. So this is the teachings of Heinrich Schenker, the late 1800s, you know, theorist who came up with all these theories about how to analyze Beethoven by finding the, you know, Hauptstimme, etc. And Maneri never heard of the guy. And it's like, you know, Maneri was like, you know, from Williamsburg, yeah, like Sicilian, like that. Schenker, yeah, man, yeah, I grew up with him. No, you know, it wasn't like that. But he said, oh yeah, man, he's the best, he's great. And Maneri had never heard of Heinrich Schenker. But he said it. He said, oh, I love him. It's my favorite. And Hoffman was like, okay, fine, okay, all right, you got the job. But I mean, if you know Joe Maneri, you know that that's what it sounded like. I would say the compositional legacy of George Russell was huge, bringing George Russell over from Sweden, where he was the director of the Swedish Radio Orchestra. But I mean, he taught here over 35 years. He brought jazz, classical, funk, world music influences together to really set the standard for what equity in contemporary artistic musical expression can be. So bringing that whole idea of these musics are equal artistic worlds, that was a huge thing. And Charles Peltz, who might be back with us by now, we don't know, but if you see him, whatever. Charles Peltz brought together a wonderful conference at here at NEC about 10 years ago with Dave Amram. And the two of Gunther and Dave Amram were reminiscing about the New York scene in the 1950s. And they were talking about that. That's what they were talking about. They were going like, hey, you could walk into this club and hear this. And these were artists. These were artists. This was the musical world. Why wasn't Juilliard teaching this? Why wasn't Manhattan teaching this? And Gunther said, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted these worlds to be together in an environment where they could be treated as equally artistic well springs of music. And George Russell and Rand Blake were two people he brought here to do that. The idea of jazz education, not as a vocational workbook-oriented discipline, but as an artistic heritage taught by significant innovative musical artists. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you that this is a heritage that every chair, in recent years has continued on, including, of course, Ken Shaphorst, who we're lucky enough to have here. This idea that those are the people who ought to be teaching our students. The idea of a contemporary musical arts program that produces composer, performer, improvisers who can flourish in a global post-genre musical world. So I only say that because he told me that he thought that's what we had grown into. And I was so happy when he did that. That was at our Joseph Maneri tribute concert about 10 years ago. The idea of a school that encourages collaborative projects and ensembles involving students across departments and disciplines. That was a big deal to him. And that was very much flourishing in his time, that we had a country fiddle ensemble. I was able to work with Joel right over here with the opera department. And we did 2 Yiddish theater scenes, right? We did that. What's it?
We certainly did, with all of the cultural.
And they sounded like Yiddish theater. Thank you. That was one of the highlights of anything I've gotten to do. And this is a wonderful conductor over here who unfortunately has to probably go to rehearsal. So, but those kinds of projects were happening all the time during Gunther's time here. Incredible projects that were bridging departments together. And so I'd like that I got to bring that back with the chamber orchestra and the opera. And again, the faculty is game for that still. The idea of learning music's oral traditions as oral traditions. And that idea of, for example, musicians, what we have in Black improvisational music is a heritage of education that was in many ways lost on jazz education in the early days. When they put things into workbooks, when they put things into chord scales, when they did all this, he really believed in this. I mean, we wouldn't have Billie Holiday without Louis Armstrong. We know this. We wouldn't have Charlie Parker without him listening to Art Tatum and Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young. We know this. I mean, this is how the music was actually transmitted, this detailed listening of oral tradition. And this is a heritage that we have in both the jazz studies department and in contemporary musical arts. And Rand has been really the incredible champion of this at NEC. The intensity of NEC's musical life, which I believe many people wish was not as intense, but Gunther, I remember in 1977, Gunther programming Gurlieder and Wojciech in the same semester. Okay, so I'm sorry Joel wasn't here to hear that. You might get the idea. An emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration, very, very big thing. Collaborating again. Dancers were mentioned, Al-Tunji. I mean, this was very much part of it. An emphasis on training students to have a critical eye and see through hype. This was a big thing with him. He would be like, that's not, look, that's not good music, and you need to say that. So one of his favorite targets was shallow fusion projects. He would always say, like, I hear one kind of music here, but the other one, no, they don't know that other kind of music. An emphasis on the importance of musicians having high-level oral skills at a time when many other schools have ratcheted down their standards in that regard. Well, this is legacy of Gunther, that we still have that. The idea that the musical world is one continuum in an era when so many other schools have chosen to educate their students as specialists in one musical genre, niche, or discipline. A world music performance legacy replete with ensembles that explore, well, at this point, a lot of things in my department. I don't need to list them, but I mean, we're starting our festival in that this week. And the jazz department has Brazilian ensemble and the gospel ensemble. So, I mean, both of these departments really carry on that legacy. The idea of an expanded musical canon that goes way beyond the Western musical canon. The creation of a community services program. This was a very big thing that Gunther did. Offering discounted or free lessons to students of all ages from the surrounding community. And hosting a gospel jubilee every year. We often see, we're passing by the screen in the other building, we see the screen, the tribute to Marvin Gaye. I was there for that. That was incredible. That was incredible. These kinds of community events, making the school a place that the community, the whole community felt was their home. So these are the things that I feel are a legacy that I have to say, under Andrea, I feel the school is definitely embracing, including that idea of the complete musician, which a phrase which was not spoken for many years here, actually. And I can remember the faculty council meeting. I don't know if Ken was there when somebody spoke up and said, like, well, one thing we can all agree on is we're no longer trying to create the complete musician. And I'm like, we're not. But that really has been revived very much in recent years. So these are the things that I wanted to throw out there as something that, the school really, I think, owes to Gunther for opening up these ideas and streams of thought. Thank you. And let's hear from Michael Frischkopf. Now, I asked Michael to speak because Michael was a student of Rand Blake's during high school. So they haven't seen each other for a while, so that'll be nice. When he was in high school, when I got here, he was sort of the little genius piano player from Lexington who would play at the Saturday classes and already had mastered Thelonious Monk and Ellington and quite a few other artists. And I think I have a feeling that Rand was kind of cruelly dangling him in front of us to say, like, and you guys are in college, so what can you do? And then Michael came back, taking a year off from his studies at Brown University and joined the school for a year in the, what was at the time, the third stream department, and went on to an incredible academic career and performance career as an expert on Islamic music. And I was delighted to be invited to a conference called Borderless Flows, which was the idea of how music crosses borders and doesn't know it, and how that happens and what that means. And that was held at the University of Alberta in Edmonton just this past September. So I'd love to hear from Michael about how his experience here shaped who he is, and also about how he sees that world in higher education elsewhere, or if NEC really stands out.
Right.
Hi, Michael. Rand.
Hello, Rand. Can you all hear me?
All right, yes. Fantastic.
Yes, good. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be able to be with you all because I miss the conservatory. I live far away in Western Canada, occasionally come back for a visit, but it's infrequent. So it's great to be included. Thank you for that. I it's wonderful also to hear about Gunther. I have to admit, I never met Gunther, but I heard about him constantly from other people. So I sort of feel like I absorbed an echo of Gunther Schuller in mostly studies with Rand Blake and also Henkes, Peter Rowe, and all of the students who were around. It's sort of like a wave that reflects off of different surfaces over and over. I've enjoyed very much hearing about the conservatory, and I think it's absolutely true that it was a unique environment. So I was a high school student in Lexington, Massachusetts, and I must have been 16 or so when my teacher, Sandy Peasley, who was a good friend of Rand's, got us in touch and recommended that I come and take lessons with Rand Blake. And that was absolutely transformative. I mean, I felt, when I look back, I see that this is what really shaped my entire life and the way I think about music, not just from a conservatory point of view of producing music, but the larger sphere of music as an essential part of humanity. The ethnomusicologist John Blacking talked about music as being an essential attribute of what it means to be human. And I think that humanistic dimension of ethnomusicology, which is my academic discipline, really comes through my studies in third stream, at the time third stream, and now contemporary musical arts. There are so many implications from that way of studying music, which is open, which really is, emphasizes the borderless flows. The conference that Henkes mentioned really is a sort of an encapsulation of what that third stream was for me. And I think that's sort of how we arrived at that title in part. I'm not a big believer in borders. And unfortunately, we live in an era of borders, militarized borders, and increasing specialization, which really reduces our ability not only to see the large picture, but also to communicate with each other. And I think it's very important to remain the complete musician, not just the complete musician, but the complete human in a way. Not that we can master everything like the Renaissance people supposedly could, which they couldn't because it was very Eurocentric, but just the idea that there aren't borders, that you can go out and explore further and further afield. And that's certainly what's guided my life ever since. I had a brief stint in high tech. I was a math major at Yale, actually not Brown, but close enough. And then I came back eventually to music because I realized I didn't want to spend my time sitting in front of a computer screen, which so many people do, even if they're not in high tech. But that's just sort of how we've been pigeonholed into these very tight bounded spaces. And it's not healthy, and it doesn't help the human race. So this idea of freedom and openness and sort of the humanistic idea of music that I'm also hearing about Gunther, I didn't know a lot of these, most of these stories, over kind of a narrow technical proficiency, I think is really, really important. In a way, it's a kind of an early, I mean, these days, the buzzwords in academia are EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization of curricula, which all too often is lip service more than reality, because in fact, it takes money to do these things. That's the bottom line that a lot of university administrators don't always realize. And obviously Gunther Schuller, and then, Rand and you, Henkes, much earlier grasped this. And I realized it was not always easy probably for the conservatory to forge ahead on that path. But I would say that in the universities, especially in Canada, but typically in the large music schools, there is sort of an excessive amount of specialization that precludes that kind of connection building. And I would go so far as to say, and this actually came up in our conference, and it sort of a light bulb went off in my head when, Henkes, you said something or other, I know it was that graduates of contemporary musical arts or third stream in the past actually have better employment prospects than people who are very narrowly focused on one thing. And something clicked, because this is exactly the kind of argument that deans of faculties of arts or arts and science in some places make, which is that when you get the broad training in history and philosophy and music and all the humanities, this prepares you to connect in so many different ways. It isn't, I mean, obviously the higher value of that is that you become a more well-rounded human being. It's a sort of an ethical education. But even if you have to bring it all down to simply dollars and cents, which, you know, so many people do these days, STEM does not actually necessarily produce better employability. So then I realized that there's a kind of analogy to be made that third stream or contemporary musical arts is to the conservatory as liberal arts education is to the university. That is, if someone is very narrowly focused on just one instrument, and yes, they might have to take some other courses, but they don't really want to do it. And we have lots of students like that here who really just want to practice their instrument. And I understand they want to get good at their instrument, but in sort of narrowing their vision, they're actually making it more difficult for themselves to succeed as musicians in a broader sense, or maybe to go on in some other field. And that brings up an interesting connection that many graduates from third stream did go on in ethnomusicology. I mean, a whole bunch. I mean, you did, Hankus. And I think that the reason is that it is a broad field. Ethnomusicology is to music studies in general, also has this sort of liberal arts dimension to it, that it's everything. It's really everything under the sun. I think third stream also had an advantage over the way in the conservatory, and maybe this is due to Gunther Schuller's tremendous influence, which is that so often ethnomusicology defines itself in a very othering way, which I don't think is all that healthy. That is, the musicologists do this, and the music theorists do that, and the conductors do this, and then ethnomusicology does everything else. And these negative definitions are, I find, not all that productive. A parallel one is world music, this concept of world music, which is sort of everything but whatever is more mainstream, whether it's commercial or jazz or classical music. And what I liked about my experience in third stream, and my first big taste of this in high school was going to those backwaters and byways of the 20th century classes on Saturdays, because it's just absolutely mind and ear stretching to include everything. So it wasn't, whereas in world music, we say, oh, you know, you can learn some Japanese classical music and you can learn some Indian classical music and some African drumming. But in backwaters and byways, we were doing also Bartok and Miles Davis, and along with Greek, you know, folk tunes, or Mikis Theodorakis and Bollywood, or whatever it was. I'm dying to go back to find my old notebooks, because it was really such an education in diversity, inclusion, equity, all those things that we talk about only in the last few years were already there. And I think this affected my approach to ethnomusicology, this sort of more humanistic boundary crossing idea, to the extent that I didn't really want to focus on just one thing. So I did my master's work in West Africa. Rand always used to say, you need to develop your sense of rhythm. So finally, I went off to West Africa and studied that, and studied it orally, of course. And then I needed to develop my sense of melody. I went to Cairo and I lived there for 6 years. And so these things fed into my musicality, even as it was also scholarship. And ultimately, I realized that the value of all of this was more humanistic for me than it was the narrow, you know, a scholar who just keeps on publishing on one thing, sort of equivalent to the violinist who only wants to study a certain repertoire and play it extremely well and technically correctly. And you know, when I used to work for Rand in the office, a lot of people would call and say, well, what is third stream? So I had to develop some ready definitions. And when I tried to remember what I used to tell people on the phone, I realized I'm now seeing it through my, you know, my experiences over the past, well, it's been a long time since I was doing that in 1981. So I remember what I used to say, well, you know, you listen, you kind of internalize the music, and then you synthesize something which is you know, which is really you, which is your unique voice, so that you can express your unique voice, your inner voice, and then you interact with other people. And it's that interactive part which has really come to the fore to me, and sort of, I realize now that I can trace it back in the form of what's sometimes called applied ethnomusicology. So this is ethnomusicology that tries to achieve some positive social change in the world. And the way I've always approached that is that music is the connector. And one of the things that used to happen in the third stream program was that Rand would say, you guys get together and do a version of this, and then you guys get together and do a version of this, and then the concerts would be all these overlapping groups, people playing in different configurations, sharing their internalized personal musical styles, and actually in listening to each other, also reacting to each other, and creating this feedback loop. And I realized that these feedback loops are really the basis for the social connectivity that happens in musical situations, and how people can connect to each other on that very human, affective musical level, which is so different than other kinds of more verbal discourse. So I've really tried to apply that, also injecting a Arabic term called tarab, which has to do with the feedback loop among performers and between performers and audience members, who are free to, clap and exclaim in the middle of the performance, not this quiet, darkened concert hall, but the lights are on and there's a continuous feedback loop going on. And so when you get the idea that it's including, everybody's a performer, there's no audience performer distinction, everyone is contributing, everyone is interacting, they're building some sort of rapport in such a situation, which may actually outlast the performance itself. It's ephemeral, possibly, but it's also the basis on which most societies do build their social cohesion and cultural continuity from one generation to the next. And a lot of what we've lost is because of the sort of intrusion, or as Habermas would say, colonization of the commercial music world. We have sort of generational music. Each generation, you're an older generation, you don't like the music of your kids, your grandkids, and so on. But in many traditional societies, that's not the case. And so you have these connections between generations and between peoples who are coexisting in the same space. For example, in Ghana, where there's upwards of 60 ethnic groups, but there's a lot of musics that can connect people together. And so I realized that in applied ethnomusicology, trying to create positive social change in the world, that these ideas are very important, and that they go right back to Third Stream and those amazing concerts that we used to have. And so I developed this idea of transcultural music which is transcultural itself in the sense that it draws on different sources and so on, but also that binds people coming from different backgrounds. And ultimately, I decided that there really is no such thing as culture as a countable noun. That's kind of my mantra, is there, culture is not a countable noun. You can't say culture A, culture B, culture C, because culture, unlike language, where maybe you can differentiate them because there's a matter of comprehension, but with culture, it's really a continuous flow. And so we get back to these borderless flows. And for me, that's sort of what Third Stream is all about, transcultural music and connecting through music, not just to make great music or to make virtuosic music, but to all connect with each other as human beings. So I'll leave it at that.
Michael. So we want to open it up to the participants. And by the way, I want to give credit to Charles Peltz, because when we were going to do this, I said this was going to be an online program. And he said, no, make it a hybrid program. And I think that's amazing. I'm so happy that you all were here. And also we got to eat and drink. And Charles, I think you had something you wanted to add as our first.
Well, first of all, as Hankus knows, forgive me, but I'm remote, even though I work at NEC and was there all day today, because my daughter was dedicating a piano at her school and she was playing tonight. And I thought my role as father present to that needed to take precedence. I think that what that I'd like to offer, because I think that many of the people who are on this program were here when Gunther did know Gunther. And so that's a first person knowledge. And I think that's essential to this idea of the legacy, because one has to know the beginnings of the legacy. And many of the people who are here remember rehearsals and experiences with him. And while there might be in the current climate a resistance to Western-centric education or Western-centric music, it is still a deeply rich tradition. And I would like to think that at least one should think that their students should be well-versed in something deeper, and maybe not always as broad, but certainly deeply. And one of the things that I think that Gunther's legacy really did, and was he was able in every moment to draw upon all of his experiences and his knowledges and utilize them at the moment when it would be most interesting. So he could be in a moment with a working on Wozzeck and make an allusion to Ockeghem or to Coltrane, because he heard the DNA of certain things in all things. And when you recognize that it is all fruit of the same tree, you're interested in making salad with it. Because you are sure that all those tastes will be good together. And I will, we all have our anecdotes. I bet there are people who are on this call who are just dying to share anecdotes that illuminate and illustrate the points that some of us are making. But when, Gunther begins a rehearsal of Rhapsody in Blue and stops the clarinet and says, no, you have to pretend like you've never heard Benny Goodman. You have to play it like he never existed. You have to go back and just know. And then he repeated 5 or 6 names of clarinet players from the 1910s and 20s. He's bringing to the plate all of that diverse knowledge. And I think that's really the legacy. The legacy, not the legacy, it is a legacy. It's the ability at the moment to bring all the knowledge to bear that someone has experienced in order to enhance the moment they are in. And the deeper that experience and the broader that experience, the more conjugations of music can be made. And that is what he was on 2 legs.
Yeah. Thank you. Someone else have something to add? Someone who's present? Mr. Stewart?
I wouldn't assume. I remember Gunther from, I was at the New England Conservatory my 2nd year when he came in. And it was things changed quite a bit. He brought in Leon Barzan for one thing, and Prousness was there and all that. It was a very interesting time.
This is Frederick Prousness, the conductor. You want to use the mic just so the Zoom people can hear? That'd be great.
I don't have much to say. I just, it goes back to when I was first here and my 2nd year at the New England Conservatory. That was when Gunther Schuller was first here as president. And I felt the difference when I was here. There was no question of it, and all that. I was a student of Frederick Prousness in conducting. And this is an exciting time, but I didn't know all the things that you were talking about tonight. This was later. I didn't know that was what was going to happen in the future. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Anyone else want to take the mic and have something to say, or is there anyone in the chat who has a comment or a question? Well, and anyone in the panel who wants to add anything? It's perfect. I mean, it's almost 8 o'clock and we can wind up. But Olivia? Oh, someone should speak about Rudolph College. Well, this was one of the things Gunther did. Gunther looked at who was still alive, who was really important in music history. And he brought those people to NEC. So Rudolph Kolisch was the violinist in the Kolisch Quartet. The Kolisch Quartet premiered all of Arnold Schoenberg's quartets and many other of the Berg. I mean, a lot of works. Webern, Opus 20, what? 25? I'm not sure. Anyhow, but Kolisch was the guy who, in the Vienna scene in the 1920s, was leading the quartet that was really moving music forward. He brought Louis Krasner, who had graduated from NEC actually in the 1920s. But he felt he was important because he was the guy who premiered the Berg Violin Concerto. And these people were teaching at NEC well into their 80s, which, I mean, you could say that tradition continues with Rand, who is well into his 80s and still teaching here. So he felt it was very important for people to have a sense of these historical figures. When I came to NEC, I just want to say I studied with Fernand Gillet, who had been first oboe in the Boston Symphony under Koussevitzky and had retired when Koussevitzky left in 1947, and Gillet was 65 years old. He was graduated Paris Conservatory in 1897. And it was an incredible experience. And Gunther, one of those people on the faculty, very much. Thank you for that. That's a great observation. Any other? All right, well, I think we'll conclude. I just want to thank the Alumni Association and Advancement and the people who have provided this wonderful food and drink that I hope you will make sure to leave these tables bare. And we'll conclude. And thank you all. Thanks to our live panelists and our online panelists. And I'm delighted that we could have this.
Great evening.
There's no way we'd be here 50 years later if this hadn't started. And that was really Gunther who made it possible to start this. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hankus.
Thank you.
Charles.
Thank
Every-
you, Hankus.